"What are you waiting for, Sergeant? Salute me." That was the demand, issued sharply and without hesitation by a senior American officer in full view of Buckingham Palace. The crowd froze, cameras lowered, every eye turned toward the Royal Guard. But what happened next? It wasn't the salute he expected. It wasn't a salute at all. It was something far quieter and infinitely more powerful. If you want to know what really happened, hit that subscribe button and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Because this story doesn't just show what it means to wear a uniform. It shows what it means to uphold it. The spring air outside Lancaster House carried a kind of ceremonial stillness. The kind that settles just before an official event begins. Light filtered through the wrought iron gates and dappled the gravel in shifting patterns, as though the city itself was holding its breath. Lance Corporal Nathan Hale stood motionless at the entrance to the courtyard, framed by the limestone facade of the historic building and the flutter of Union flags overhead. Clad in the red tunic of the Coldstream Guards, white belt cinched with mathematical precision, and bearskin cap tall and unmoving, he might as well have been carved from marble. He was there as a ceremonial representative of the British Army during the Joint Defence Reception, a diplomatic event hosted between the UK Ministry of Defence and an allied foreign embassy. To passing tourists, he was another palace guard on another government day. To the military attachés and senior delegates attending the reception inside, he was a signal of British formality, of centuries-old continuity, of the silence that held back chaos. Nathan was 30, clean-featured with pale skin and sharp cheekbones softened by the shadow of his cap. His posture was faultless, not just from muscle memory, but from belief. His father, also a former guardsman, had once told him, "People don't salute the uniform, they salute the stillness." Nathan understood that now more than ever. Today was no ordinary post. Though Lancaster House lay within ceremonial range of Buckingham Palace, this particular assignment required delicate footing. He wasn't standing outside a royal residence. He was posted within a shared diplomatic perimeter where embassy politics, military protocols, and ceremonial traditions all collided like tectonic plates. Inside the courtyard, security details in earpieces stood shoulder to shoulder with embassy officials in tailored suits. Silver trays passed among the crowd like tiny satellites, carrying drinks and canapes from one language cluster to another. The reception was a polished blend of NATO formality and state hospitality. And among the more notable arrivals was Colonel Adrian Kovac, a foreign senior officer known more for battlefield command than diplomatic subtlety. He had commanded legions, written military doctrine, and once described ceremonial uniforms as theatrical relics of empire. But he was powerful, respected, now here at a British-run event with one of those very relics standing just meters from the entrance. Nathan didn't blink when Kovac's motorcade arrived. He didn't flinch when a younger officer snapped a photo inches from his ear. His boots stayed rooted to the same cobblestone square he'd been ordered to stand on 2 hours prior. The stillness wasn't passive. It was chosen, defiant in its restraint. A ripple moved through the crowd as Colonel Kovac stepped out of the car, broad-shouldered, bald, with piercing grey eyes that scanned his surroundings like a general inspecting a forward base. He wore a tailored grey uniform thick with decorations, and his gloved hands swung as he walked, not lazily but purposefully, like a man always on a march. Nathan heard the murmurs before he saw the colonel approach. "Is this one real? Looks like he hasn't blinked all morning. Why do they still do this?" The Coldstream Guard remained unmoving. That was the point. Colonel Kovac stepped forward and stopped within a foot of Nathan's face. He leaned in slightly, hands behind his back, inspecting the guard with a mix of curiosity and contempt. "British discipline," he said aloud, not hiding his accent, or just a very still mannequin. A few nearby guests laughed uneasily. Cameras turned. Nathan's jaw didn't twitch. Kovac tilted his head. "You salute superior officers, guardsman. Or is that beneath the pageantry?" The moment hung in the courtyard air, like the pause between lightning and thunder. Nathan did nothing, said nothing, and somewhere deep in his chest, beneath the brass buttons and stitched honour, something in him prepared for what was about to follow. Colonel Adrian Kovac stood in front of Lance Corporal Nathan Hale with the amused curiosity of a man inspecting a historical artifact. Around them, the embassy courtyard buzzed with diplomatic conversation and clinking glasses, but a visible radius of tension had formed near the ceremonial post, like a quiet eye in the centre of a storm. Nathan remained still. He didn't glance at the man standing less than an arm's length away, his eyes fixed forward, breathing slow and deliberate, as if the rest of the world didn't exist. Kovac, apparently unfazed, turned to one of his junior officers, a sharp-featured lieutenant with a scar down his cheek and a smirk that hadn't left his face since they arrived. "In our barracks," Kovac said loudly enough for others to hear, "you'd be reprimanded for standing still while an ally stands in front of you. We salute our friends, unless the British have changed what friendship means." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter came from a few members of the foreign delegation nearby. One of them, holding a cocktail glass and speaking in their native tongue, added, "Perhaps he's awaiting orders from the Queen herself." Nathan didn't blink. Several UK officers were now watching from across the courtyard. Among them stood Major Eleanor Shaw, one of the liaison officers from the Ministry of Defence. Shaw was in her late 40s, sharp in every sense, posture, speech, judgment, and she had seen enough military diplomacy to sense when someone was stepping out of line. She approached briskly, stopping beside the colonel with just enough distance to preserve protocol. "Colonel Kovac," she said diplomatically, "thank you again for joining us. I trust your accommodations have been satisfactory." Kovac turned, lips curling in mock courtesy. "Ah, Major Shaw. Yes, thank you. Though I admit I'm fascinated by your choice to place active soldiers on display, not something we see much outside of parades." She smiled politely. "The Guard stands here at the request of both the Palace and the Foreign Office. It's a sign of respect." "To whom?" he asked, glancing at Nathan again. "He hasn't moved since I arrived, not even to acknowledge senior command." "Ceremonial guards do not salute while on post," she replied, measured. "Not even to generals. The uniform binds them to a different kind of duty, of stillness. It's protocol." Kovac's nostrils flared slightly, but he said nothing. His lieutenant whispered something in his ear. The colonel raised an eyebrow. Then, with a calculated pause, Kovac stepped in front of Nathan once more and raised his hand in a sharp, formal military salute. Precise, practiced, unmistakably intentional. Every conversation in a 20-foot radius fell silent. The salute held a challenge. Nathan didn't move. Kovac dropped his arm and shook his head with exaggerated pity. No discipline, or perhaps just decorative. It wasn't the insult itself that landed hardest. It was the tone. The implication that ceremonial discipline was somehow lesser. That silence was cowardice. From behind the security rope, a young staffer, maybe 23, dressed in embassy black, watched the exchange unfold with rising discomfort. He turned to a nearby guest, whispering, "Is this allowed?" The guest, a retired military man with a chest full of ribbons, answered without turning his gaze away. "It's not about permission, it's about composure. And that guard has more of it than the man testing him." A small group of tourists from a public viewing window had begun filming from a distance, sensing tension. A child asked her mother what was happening. The mother shushed her and turned toward the courtyard, camera half raised. Major Shaw stepped forward again, voice low but firm. "Colonel, with full respect to your rank, I'd remind you, he is under command. He cannot move or respond, and he will not." Kovac studied her face, then glanced once more at Nathan. "Then perhaps Britain no longer teaches its soldiers how to honour fellow warriors, only how to stand silent and pretend they're made of stone." Before Shaw could respond, a voice came from the crowd, low, quiet, but unwavering. "He's not pretending." Everyone turned. It was an older man, seated in a wheelchair just beyond the perimeter. His chest bore a regimental badge from the Royal Marines, faded with age, and a thick scar ran down the side of his neck. The veteran's voice, though gravelly, carried in the hush. "You're not looking at theatre, Colonel. You're looking at someone who's been trained to stand through anything, and from where I'm sitting, he's doing a damn better job than some men in motion." The crowd fell into a strange, respectful stillness. Even the birds seemed quieter for a beat. Nathan didn't move, but the silence now belonged to him. The moment lingered in the air like gunpowder after a volley. Sharp, thick with tension, and impossible to ignore. Colonel Kovac didn't respond to the veteran's comment. He didn't need to. The silence said enough. His salute had been left hanging unanswered, not out of disrespect, but out of something more difficult to confront. Protocol deeper than ego. He turned sharply and walked away, flaring slightly as he moved, flanked by his aides and a handful of murmuring staff. But the damage was already spreading, small circles of guests whispering, unsure whether what they'd just witnessed had been a gaffe or a provocation. At the far end of the courtyard, a BBC diplomatic correspondent lowered her phone slowly and muttered to her cameraman, "You get all that?" The cameraman nodded, eyes still trained on the Coldstream guard, whose posture hadn't shifted once. Inside the house, Major Eleanor Shaw stepped through the side doors and into the inner hall, already tapping out a coded message to her Modi liaison. One line stood out among her quick entry: public provocation against ceremonial guard, optics now priority. Back outside, Lance Corporal Nathan Hale remained at his post. To the casual observer, nothing had changed. He was still the statue of red and black, still the embodiment of restraint. But to those who'd been watching closely, those who'd seen the colonel's manoeuvre, it was clear the balance of the event had subtly, irrevocably shifted. Several foreign officers watched from a distance now, whispering behind their hands. A few British officers formed a loose ring further off, close enough to observe, far enough to avoid interfering. No one wanted to inflame the tension further, but neither did they want to pretend it hadn't happened. Near the entrance to the house, a civilian attaché in a navy suit turned to a French diplomat and said, "That guard, he just made more of a statement by not reacting than half the people inside will all night." A young American major, guest of the embassy, nodded. "You can tell a soldier by how he handles pressure. And he just got yelled at by a NATO colonel and didn't even blink." And then, of course, there was the digital wave. Within minutes, clips from smartphones had hit Twitter, Telegram and TikTok under hashtags like Darn Silent Salute, Ceremonial Clash and Dar British Discipline. The clips were rough, taken from awkward angles with muffled audio, but the moment was unmistakable. A foreign officer saluting with smug expectation, a British guard unmoving, a veteran calling out from his wheelchair, "He's not pretending." One tweet from a retired Royal Navy officer went viral within the hour. You don't need to raise your hand to salute when your entire body is already standing for something. Inside the press office, attached to Lancaster House, aides were already fielding calls from the Daily Telegraph, The Guardian, and an American defense columnist asking for official comment. But back in the courtyard, none of that mattered to Nathan. What mattered was the sound of a child asking why someone would shout at a soldier, the hushed awe in a crowd that didn't know how to read silence, and the warmth of the sun beating down on the back of his neck, steady, grounding, real. Behind the velvet rope, the young embassy staffer who had earlier tried to warn his colleagues now stood with his hands folded in front of him, watching the Coldstream guard with something between guilt and admiration. He didn't speak, but he didn't look away. Then another figure approached, not with bravado or mockery, but with deliberation. A woman in a long navy dress, civilian but familiar with ceremony. A name tag read Dr. Kavita Rane, Defence Ethics Advisor to the Joint Committee. She stood near the barrier and said softly, "Not for the guard, but for the others nearby. This is why we teach restraint, because when provoked, a soldier's silence can echo louder than a general's command." People around her nodded, not performatively, not out of obligation. They understood now that this wasn't about who saluted whom. It wasn't even about military hierarchy. It was about what happens when pride meets principle. Later, just past the hour mark, Nathan's rotation was due to shift. A second guard approached to begin the changing routine. Even this movement, normally a minor ceremonial detail, drew eyes. Guests watched as Nathan performed his handoff with flawless precision, his eyes still locked ahead, never once breaking composure, not even as his relief took over. As he marched back toward the designated resting corridor, a few guests instinctively straightened their postures. One man removed his cap. A child clapped once, softly, before being hushed, and as Nathan stepped out of view and into the shadowed archway of the embassy house, the man in the wheelchair, who had said only one line, leaned over to a young corporal nearby. He did more for the regiment today than most ever will in combat. The corridor beyond the embassy courtyard was cool and quiet, lined with deep wood panelling and old portraits of military and political figures who'd shaped the post-war decades. Nathan Hale walked its length in measured, precise steps, still within view of internal security, still bound by ceremonial bearing, but alone now with his thoughts. He moved like a soldier unwinding a coiled spring, disciplined in every joint, every rotation of the foot. But inside, his memory was already miles away. He was 19 again, standing in the rigid line of recruits at Pirbright, the nerve centre of British Army discipline. His boots were too clean then, his uniform still creaked with newness, and yet that was the first time he understood what it meant to not respond. It was a summer day during training rotation. One of the younger guardsmen had cracked under pressure. A visiting officer, foreign, loud and condescending, had mocked the British obsession with ceremony, walking down the inspection line with theatrical salutes and theatricaler insults. One poor recruit blinked, twitched, and gave a half nod. The punishment was swift, public, humiliating. Afterward, the drill sergeant gathered them in the gravel yard and said, "A guard's silence is not surrender. It's control. It's the difference between discipline and pride. Anyone can yell. Only 1 in 100 can stand still when their honour's being dragged through the dirt." Nathan had never forgotten that. Years later, that same lesson was tested in Kenya when he was stationed with a peacekeeping contingent on a joint support base outside Garissa. The mission was straightforward: protect the airstrip, support local command, liaise with humanitarian agencies. Until the night the radios went silent and the compound lights cut out just past midnight. Nathan was the youngest on watch when the first crack of gunfire split the dark. In those first seconds, when panic surged and orders got scrambled, it wasn't his weapons handling or perimeter sweeps that held the team together. It was the fact that he didn't move. He stood his position, called targets clearly, reoriented the evac teams under fire. And later, when the senior commander reviewed the footage, it was Nathan they pointed to and said, "That's the only one who understood that restraint under fire is its own kind of weapon." The commendation came later, quiet and understated. But it wasn't the paperwork that stuck with him. It was what one of the local Kenyan liaison officers said after they cleared the area the next morning. "When bullets fly, we see who believes in what they were trained for." Nathan hadn't spoken much after that. He didn't need to. Back in the embassy corridor, he paused near a side mirror. His reflection stared back, tunic still flawless, cap resting beneath one arm, gloves folded over his hand. No one watching would have guessed the chaos he'd once stood through in a sand-blown airfield half a world away. And yet today, under the diplomatic gaze of half a dozen nations, it was the simple act of not saluting that had brought everything roaring back. Not out of weakness, not defiance, but because some duties weren't about motion, they were about meaning. He closed his eyes for a breath, then stepped back into the light, into the edge of the reception, and toward what he sensed was still not finished. The garden terrace behind Lancaster House was awash in soft conversation, rising laughter, and the occasional clink of glassware. White bunting hung loosely between iron lampposts, and the afternoon sun had reached that warm, golden hour where everything looked dignified, even the tension. Lance Corporal Nathan Hale had returned to his post near the south gate, rotated back in at the request of the hosting officer, though no one said aloud why. There was a visible energy shift now. Guests didn't drift too close. Those who had earlier posed for photos now kept respectful distance. Even the foreign military attachés walked with a kind of side-glancing caution around him. The one person who had not adjusted was Colonel Adrian Kovac. If anything, the man seemed emboldened. He'd spent the last 30 minutes moving through groups of embassy officials, grumbling about British symbolism, about performative military culture, about how real soldiers salute first and speak after. Then, just as Nathan adjusted his stance between rotations, brief, ceremonial, seamless, Kovac moved again, this time with purpose. He crossed the gravel yard with heavy, deliberate steps, flanked by 2 aides in matching grey uniforms. Several guests noticed, turned and fell silent mid-conversation. The sound of shoes on stone echoed louder than it should have. Nathan heard him coming, but he did not react. His body had already become a kind of fixed monument. Chin square, shoulders level, eyes forward, but inside, every nerve was listening. Kovac stopped less than a meter from Nathan. "Guardsman," he said loudly, enough to capture the entire garden's attention. "You are once again in the presence of a superior officer and NATO ally." He snapped a formal salute, not sarcastic this time, but sharp, correct, and unmistakably demanding a response. Nathan remained still. The aides behind Kovac looked at each other. Guests held their breath. One woman lowered her wineglass in slow motion. Kovac's hand dropped. He didn't hide his irritation. "I have saluted you twice today," he said, projecting his voice. "Once out of curiosity, now out of respect. And still nothing." Silence. The colonel glanced around, voice rising. "Tell me then, does your regiment teach you to ignore Allied rank? Or is it British custom to stand mute while an ally honours you?" From somewhere behind the hedges, someone whispered, "Is he serious?" Nathan did not move. That was when Kovac crossed the line. He stepped forward, violating ceremonial distance, and raised his hand once more, not to strike, not to push, but to deliver the salute inches from Nathan's face. A theatrical mirror of military authority. "Return the salute," he said sharply, "or explain to these guests why the British Army no longer respects military tradition." Major Eleanor Shaw had seen enough. She stepped forward from the perimeter, her voice clipped and commanding. "Colonel, step back from the guard, now." Kovac didn't move. Then, before anyone else could speak, Nathan did. A breath, a shift in the wind, and then, without turning his head, without adjusting posture, he spoke in the calmest, most devastating voice in the courtyard. "With respect, Colonel, I am not permitted to salute while on ceremonial post. To do so would be a breach of discipline, but I do recognize your rank. I will remember your salute long after your voice has faded." It wasn't defiance, it was dignity. The words rippled across the terrace like a drop in still water. The aides behind Kovac froze. A steward dropped a tray near the table line. Someone at the far end of the garden muttered, "Did he just speak?" Kovac, stunned, took a step back. It wasn't fear, it was unfamiliarity. He'd expected either submission or protest, not quiet moral clarity. For the first time all day, he had nothing to say. And then, from near the reception tent, a slow, deliberate clap began. One pair of hands, then another. It wasn't celebratory or sarcastic. It was steady, grounded, respectful. Then a voice rang out from beside the wine bar. Older, weathered, unmistakably military. "In this country, we salute with discipline. And what you've just witnessed is a masterclass in it." The voice belonged to Admiral Jonathan Field, Royal Navy, retired, guest of the ministry, and a man who hadn't clapped for anything ceremonial in 5 years. He walked forward with a cane in hand and stood beside Major Shaw, eyes locked on Kovac. "That guardsman just gave more honour to your salute than any hand gesture could have. You just didn't know where to look for it." Kovac looked at the Admiral, at Nathan, then at the eyes watching him from every direction. His jaw clenched, gave a tight nod, and turned without another word, vanishing into the marble archway. A few seconds later, a young cadet leaned over to a British general and asked, in a voice barely above a whisper, "Was that allowed?" The general didn't answer right away. He just stared at Nathan, who had already returned to motionless stance. Then he muttered, "Number, but it was correct." The courtyard didn't return to normal, and it couldn't, not after what had just happened. Colonel Kovac was gone, his footsteps swallowed by the echoing corridors of Lancaster House, but the space he left behind felt charged, not with conflict, but with something quieter, like the moment after a bell has stopped ringing, and your ears are still adjusting to the absence. Lance Corporal Nathan Hale remained still, now alone at the southern post again, but no longer just a fixture. He had become the invisible centre of gravity, the one person no one could stop glancing at. His words hadn't echoed. They didn't need to. They had landed with precision, clear, controlled and unforgettable, and in a gathering built around handshakes, glasses raised and speeches, it was the one moment of silence that everyone would remember. The reception resumed, but slowly. A quartet resumed playing somewhere near the garden terrace. Bach, perhaps, or some neutral string composition meant to ease back into formal grace. But even the musicians seemed hesitant, as if unsure whether music belonged after a scene like that. Back near the hedgerow, a woman in her 60s, an attaché from the Canadian consulate, spoke quietly to her husband. "I've never seen anyone command a room by doing less." The man nodded. "Because it wasn't less." That was everything. A few steps away, the young girl who had asked earlier why the man was being shouted at now stood with her father by the rope line again. She was holding a Union Jack flag in one hand and looking up at Nathan as if he was something out of a storybook. Her father crouched beside her and whispered, "Do you remember what we said about guarding the Queen?" She nodded slowly. "Well, that man just guarded something more than royalty. He guarded what it means to be British." Nathan didn't hear them. But something shifted. A breeze caught the corner of his tunic. A bird darted low between hedges. The air felt less heavy somehow. And then Admiral Field returned, this time not with the booming presence of a senior figure ready to speak truth, but with the quiet posture of someone paying respects. He approached the post slowly, stopping just short of the ceremonial line, eyes level with Nathan's. And he didn't salute, he didn't speak. He just stood there, still, quiet, equal. For several seconds, neither man moved. Then Admiral Field, without changing expression, gave the faintest of nods. Not military, not protocol, human, recognition. And as he turned to walk away, a few guests instinctively mirrored him, forming a silent, respectful path back through the garden. It wasn't a procession, it wasn't organised, it was a quiet declaration. They were no longer just guests at a diplomatic function, they had been witnesses. By the time the evening light shifted and the first line of ceremonial staff prepared for formal departure, something had changed. Not just the air, not just the tone, the memory of the salute, not given, but honoured, had become the defining note of the entire event. Not in speeches, not in headlines, but in the way people walked differently around the uniform. In the silence that followed Nathan, like a trailing shadow of reverence. In the stories that would be told, that evening over dinner tables, across embassy lounges, and inside cars on the drive home. And as the guests slowly filtered back into the main hall, a junior diplomat turned to Major Shaw and asked, "What's the British word for that kind of moment?" She didn't hesitate. Tradition. Then she looked across the courtyard, back at the still figure by the post. And him? That's why it endures. The reception inside Lancaster House carried on, but only in the way a river flows after a stone has been dropped, forever changed by a moment of disruption, ripples moving outward through every layer of conversation. Colonel Kovac did not return. Word spread quickly that he had excused himself through diplomatic staff and would be issuing no public comment. His aides remained tight-lipped, their expressions tight and unreadable, as they clustered near the back exit of the drawing room. But no one was watching them. They were watching Nathan Hale, rather, the place he had stood. He'd been relieved of post 20 minutes after the incident. No fuss, no ceremony. A quiet substitution under normal rotation protocols. But the symbolic weight of that change was not lost on anyone present. When he stepped away, it was like a bell had stopped ringing. Inside, in the temporary staff quarters just off the corridor near the kitchen wing, Nathan sat on a wooden bench, removing his gloves with the same practiced care he applied to every part of the uniform. The fabric creaked slightly in his fingers, soft from wear, but still sharp-edged with starch. The room was empty, except for Major Eleanor Shaw, who entered with the calm quiet of someone who didn't need to knock. Nathan stood automatically. "At ease," she said, folding her arms and leaning against the doorframe. "You all right?" "Yes, ma'am." She studied him for a moment. "I filed a preliminary note to the Defence Office. Told them what happened. No reprimand pending. In fact, you might want to be prepared for the opposite." Nathan didn't respond, not because he was unsure, but because he knew anything more would feel like claiming credit for something that had never been about him. Shaw walked a few paces into the room and looked at the bearskin hat resting on the hook above the locker. "He broke about 5 informal boundaries," she said quietly. "You broke none." "I spoke?" Nathan replied. She gave a half smile, and did so with more discipline than most men show in silence. She paused at the door before leaving. "You gave more than a salute today. You gave a lesson." After she left, Nathan remained seated for a long time, Then, without expression, he pulled open his locker. Inside was a small, folded towel. Beneath it, a photo. Him and his father, standing at Horse Guards parade, both in uniform. A memory frozen in sunlight. He didn't smile, but he straightened, just slightly, as if remembering who he carried with him. Across the room, another guardsman, Private Eli Rowntree, entered with his tunic slung over one shoulder. He paused, looked at Nathan, then wordlessly set a folded slip of paper on the bench beside him. Nathan picked it up. In neat handwriting it read, "That took more strength than saluting ever could." No name, no signature, just understanding. That evening, as twilight settled over the capital and the diplomatic chatter inside Lancaster House finally faded into the clink of empty glassware, a quiet exchange unfolded far from any podium or headline. A junior staffer from the embassy, the same one who'd watched in silence during the confrontation, approached the side gate with a white envelope clutched carefully in both hands. He didn't knock. He simply handed it to the palace logistics officer stationed outside the loading corridor and said, "It's for the guardsman, the one from earlier." The officer nodded without asking questions. "I'll see that it gets there." Inside the envelope was a folded piece of thick drawing paper. On it, a crayon sketch, lopsided but vivid, of a tall soldier in a red tunic and black bearskin hat, standing next to a small girl with a flag. At the bottom, written in blocky, wobbly letters, "Thank you for being so brave." No signature, just a child's tribute, as pure as it was unprompted. By the time the note reached Lance Corporal Nathan Hale's hands, he was already back at Wellington Barracks. The night shift had begun its rotations, the usual routine settling into place. Boots polished, kits squared, inspections underway. But something about the air felt different. Nathan opened the note in his quarters, seated at the edge of his bunk, beneath the same photo of him and his father. He looked at the drawing without blinking. Then, with deliberate care, he reached behind the photo frame and tucked the crayon note beneath it, just barely visible now behind the glass. A knock came at the open door. Sergeant Albie Granger stepped in, nodding once. "Heard what happened." Nathan didn't respond. Granger continued, "Kid down in the hall's been quoting you for the past hour. Says you made a NATO colonel look like he'd never seen a real soldier before." Nathan raised an eyebrow. Granger smirked. "Don't worry. I told him to shut it and polish his belt. But between you and me," he paused, "you did good, mate. Real good." Nathan gave a small nod. Then Granger added more quietly, "Next time someone questions what the uniform means, remind them it doesn't come off just because someone shouts." And with that, he turned and left. Later that week, as tourists passed through the palace gates and schoolchildren pressed against the railing for photos, Nathan took his position once again. Still, watchful, silent. No one in the crowd recognized him, except one foreign embassy attaché, visiting for an unrelated meeting, who paused mid-step, glanced toward the red figure near the archway, and gave the faintest bow of his head before continuing on. Nathan didn't respond. He didn't need to. His job was never about being seen. It was about what people saw in him. Have you ever seen someone stand their ground without raising their voice? Do you think there's power in choosing silence over spectacle? Or should a soldier always respond when publicly called out? Let us know in the comments. We read everyone, and your thoughts help shape the stories we tell next. If this story gave you a new perspective on what discipline really means, hit that like button, subscribe, and tap the bell icon so you don't miss tomorrow's story. And if you know someone who thinks Royal Guards are just for show, share this video with them. It might change their mind. More stories are already waiting for you on screen now. Watch them next, and we'll see you tomorrow, same time, same place, with another story that proves some of the strongest salutes are never seen.